Hey, Trey K here, and from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide us. A few years ago, I made a radio documentary about a textbook controversy in my home county, Kanawha County, West Virginia. This story was one of my early efforts to shine a light on a cultural divide that has been around for a long time and has been growing exponentially across America. Mine was a piece about who we were and who we are in a nation split into us and them. I wanted to learn more and to understand why people believe as they do.
In 1974, a storm was brewing in the mountains and hollows of West Virginia.
Our people are standing up again to preserve what little bit of sanity in society that we have left.
I felt like I was standing still and the world was just flying in circles around me.
This storm marked one of the first battles of today's culture wars.
I pledge allegiance to the Christian flag and to the Savior.
In Kanawha County, West Virginia, there was violence today in the continuing demonstrations against the use of controversial textbooks in the schools. The Charleston Gazette said in an editorial today, the county is near anarchy.
Earlier this week, a school in the community of Cabin Creek was bombed with a homemade device.
There was a whirlwind, all right, and all I did was just stand where I had always stood, and it was driving liberalism crazy.
Nearly 50 years after gunshots and dynamite rattled Kanawha County, the debate over curriculum choices and classroom materials has emerged again across the nation as a major topic of division. Some say educators should decide what's appropriate for students, while others advocate for more parental choice. There are also parents who call for some books to be banned from public schools. The American Library Association reports the number of books that people have challenged in schools, libraries, and university curriculum increased fourfold last year. There were challenges against nearly 1,600 individual titles. Back in the mid-1970s, my hometown school district saw religious fundamentalists fighting human secularists to determine what textbooks would look like. Today, politicians are winning public office by challenging how schools teach our nation's racial history and legacy. To understand more about this transformation, I talked with Adam Lotz, a professor at Binghamton University. He specializes on the history of education in the United States and specifically about culture war differences in American schools. There have been a number of cases where parents and politicians have asked questions recently about books and materials that are used in public school classrooms. I want to know from you, what are the typical concerns when someone is asking about book content?
We can separate out some sort of ambitious concerns, sort of a concern for winning votes, regardless of the direct impact. So without, casting aspersions on any politicians by name, I do think there's a strong temptation to seize a political moment, whether that's 1924, 1974, or 2021, 2022, to say, in the least proud tradition of American politics, that I am the person, this politician, I'm the person who's going to keep schools safe from idea X. And I think it's a very common, very unfortunate, and very damaging part of American electoral politics to use schools, and in this case books, as a sort of a charm, to say it's a low-cost political strategy. You can say, I'm going to make sure that schools are safe from this imaginary boogeyman, because it's an imaginary boogeyman and schools are already safe from it. But I think that's different, and I want to separate that out from other voices that are raised for the last 100 years about school book content, library book content, but also just more broadly curricular content, what's being taught in the schools. I think there are a lot of parents and a lot of activists who have very valid concerns about the kind of materials and the kind of ideas that are going to be included in public and public-funded forums. So whether that's a school curriculum or a school textbook, or most often these days it's a book available to be read as part of school. And I think parents have legitimate concerns, or can have legitimate concerns about books that they feel directly challenge the best parts of what they consider to be America's shared values. And activists and teachers have raised legitimate concerns saying this may be a great book. Maybe this won the Pulitzer Prize or the Nobel Prize, but it's not right for fifth graders. It's not right for ninth graders. And I think those are very legitimate concerns. They can be legitimate concerns. The problem is they get mixed together with sort of the ambitious type of grandstanding about book bans. And they also get mixed together with, I think, a less legitimate concern. So, for example, parents who are concerned about the sort of racial content of books, and they don't want their students, their children, reading books that they find racially inappropriate, which, even that phrase, racially inappropriate, is a terrible euphemism for what parents are, in my opinion, illegitimately concerned for. They want to ban books that express an actually common shared value of American culture. It's just the parents themselves don't share it.
There are books that have content. I'm thinking of some books that are often called into controversy, like Toni Morrison, where she's talking about some pretty tough facts with regard to our racial history. And yet, on the other hand, there might be some scenes that she describes in the book that might have some really brutal content that might be sexual, it might be sexually abusive, that type of thing. And what I guess what you're saying is that is a legitimate discussion for parents to say, you know what, I think that may be just a little too much. That may be a little too challenging for our kids to read. So that's one thing. The other thing would be that in some cases politicians or people who have an activist point of view, that sometimes they will maybe kind of press that pressure button to kind of tap into that concern that parents have and use that to kind of fan the flames for some type of political agenda.
I do. I think that's a fair wrap-up. And the damaging part of so, for example, Governor Youngkin in Virginia has publicly said it. It's legit. We can talk about what he's said and what he's done. I think he's given us an example of damaging kind of politicians' rhetoric that instead of putting light on the issue, just pours gas on the fire by calling for parents' rights in education, vaguely and threateningly, which is what Youngkin's during the campaign and then immediately after in Virginia, he was calling for things that are already in full existence. Parents already have rights to be aware of what their kids are learning in public schools. Parents have a right to attend public meetings of school boards. Parents have right to let their feelings be known about specific books or items in the curriculum. But by insinuating that one party was trying to take away parents' rights to be involved in the discussions, not only does that sour any discussion that we can have, but in fact, it makes it impossible to have the discussion that we vitally need to have. Not only is it okay and legitimate for not just parents, but every citizen to be involved in these discussions about what schools should teach, but we need it. We have to have it. But when politicians or pundits or any activist group makes these claims that one party is trying to stop parents from being involved, or someone is trying to sneak these sexual ideas into youth inappropriately, it takes a discussion that is not only legit but vital and required, and it makes it impossible.
Lotz points to a recent Texas example of an attempt to challenge books that he says wasn't made in good faith. Matt Krause is a Republican representative in the state legislature, and presently he's campaigning to be the state's attorney general. He sent a letter to school superintendents around the state asking about more than 800 books. Krause's inquiry explained that he was targeting books that, quote, might make students feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of race or sex. Lott says many of these books should not have been on the list.
It's a really long list. 850 is the number that gets put around, but he was very clear about the categories. Some of them seem to be troublesome for LGBTQ positive themes. Some of them seem troublesome to Representative Krause for being sort of explicitly addressing racial issues that he considered sensitive.
Well, to that end, I was just like, I think one of the books was LGBTQ Families by Leanne Curie McGee. The Letter Q, Queer Writers' Notes to Their Younger Selves by Sarah Moon. And The Underground Guide to Teenage Sexuality, an essential handbook for today's teens and parents by Michael J. Basso. So that would kind of fall under one of the categories that you talked about, which had to do with human sexuality. And then some of the books that were in the other basket that had to do with race, William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and The Hood of Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot by Mickey Kendall. All of those things seem to be things that he called into question. What do you think he's getting at with those types of books?
This for me gets into the question of what counts as a legitimate complaint about school or library content and what doesn't. To my mind, the illegitimate parts of this list are the ones that want to shield students from any content that recognizes a broader, more inclusive sense of personhood or specifically Americanness. So to put it in a slightly different way, I think some banners, book banners that is, want to restrict children's access to any notion that the we, as in who we are as Americans, they want to restrict access to any notion that we is anything besides, heterosexual, white, maybe Christian Americans. Among the disturbing parts of it is this notion that children would be, the theme throughout all this is that books should be restricted if they're dangerous to children. And the idea that a child will be endangered by the idea that other types of personhood are just as legitimate as a white Christian heterosexual personhood. The idea that is dangerous for kids is, to my mind, truly disturbing and illegitimate. You can't assert a certain shrunken vision of personhood into the public square. You can do what you want in private, but you can't put that into schools and libraries and say that only this is what we recognize as real, full personhood.
And you have studied controversies over books that are used in schools, curriculum, supplemental materials. And when you see a pushback against a book that's used in schools, are you describing what is happening now in Texas? Is that pretty much the typical argument, or is this something different?
Well, a lot of it is typical. Some parts are different. So, for example, the LGBTQ positive themes, that wasn't really, in the late part of the 20th century, that became a real issue in school content, especially with, teachers who were LGBTQ positive or LGBTQ identified. That became an issue in the late 20th century. But the theme of endangerment is exactly the same. The notion that children are put in jeopardy by exposure to ideas is a constant, and this is partly what lends the sort of screaming, vitriolic element to this issue. It's not dry. It's not about how much out of your property taxes is going to go to this or that school issue. This is, are schools intentionally endangering children, which is a issue. It's really hard to be neutral or even calm about. So I think that part is the same. People get a feeling that certain content, curricular content, is endangering kids, and even worse, that it's intentionally endangering kids, that there's a group out there who is intentionally pushing these materials to try to change children. I think that's what gives us our screaming match school board meetings and our very high pressure, high anger school politics these days. And that's the same as it was in 1920, 1930, 1940, throughout the 20th century.
I find it interesting that one of these more prominent book protests is happening in Texas, because at one time Texas had been considered as a bellwether with regard to textbook content nationally. Why was that?
Well, as well as anyone that the Texas system was set up in the 20th century to accidentally allow for a real small amount of pressure to have a huge amount of influence on textbook and school content, both in Texas and nationwide. So Norma Gabler discovered in the 1960s that she had the right, every citizen had the right to petition the school board when it came to textbooks. Unlike all the other citizens, she took advantage of that right in a way that really influenced the process by which textbooks were adopted in Texas. And because the market in Texas and California is so large, at least it was at the time, by influencing Texas, the Gablers were able to, Mel and Norma were able to, have an enormous outsize impact on the kind of school materials that were available nationwide.
In 2013, I produced a radio documentary on conservative textbook activism in Texas. The piece was called The Long Game, Texas's ongoing battle for the direction of the classroom, which featured the Gabler family's efforts to challenge some Texas classroom materials. As Adam Lotz puts it, their outsized effort shaped the actions of school boards and book publishers across the country. Here's an excerpt from that piece, and it begins with archival audio of Mel and Norma themselves.
The values which most Americans hold dear have been censored from textbooks. The very values that we need to foster if we want to continue as a moral nation.
Why should a handful of liberals totally control what's going on in our textbooks?
For more than 4 decades, these mom-and-pop citizen watchdogs played a major role in forcing the Texas education system and the giant national textbook publishing industry to take note of the values of patriotic, conservative Christian parents. In the early 1960s, Mel and Norma lived in Hawkins, a tiny East Texas town, situated around one intersection and the trains that run by. Patsy Cline's I Fall to Pieces had the #1 spot on Billboard's country chart when the Gabler's son Jim was puzzled by his 9th grade history assignment.
What I remember is that I had to learn the Gettysburg Address.
These days, Jim Gabler is in his 60s and lives in Phoenix. He's retired from a career as an IT director in the healthcare business. But back when he was in junior high school, the assignment was to find a source that contained the text of Lincoln's address. He went to the World Book Encyclopedia on his parents' shelf. Inside the volume, he noticed a photo of the famous speech as it is etched into the wall of the Lincoln Memorial. Below the photo, the speech was written out on the page. He compared the two versions.
I noticed that under God was not in the text, but it was in the picture.
Jim showed his parents how the World Book had omitted under God from Lincoln's speech.
That's what triggered them to start taking a look at what was actually in textbooks.
So from their kitchen table in Hawkins, Mel and Norma Gabler launched a textbook reviewing enterprise they called Education Research Analysts. The couple conducted the reviews. Norma read through the books while their boys were at school, and Mel did in the evenings and on the weekends when he wasn't at his clerk job for the Humble Oil Company. The operation was sustained by Mel's income.
And so the Gablers, they developed a very meticulous system for going through the textbooks line by line.
That's William Martin, a professor of religion and public policy at Rice University. He says the Gablers pioneered a metric for religious conservative citizens to measure textbook content.
And as they investigated, they found out that citizens could go to the Texas State Board of Education, which had the textbooks that were under consideration were available to be examined, and then you could testify for them or against them at public hearings.
Norma was the one who'd make the trip to Austin for the Board of Education meetings.
At one meeting, the person that was the chair kind of leaned back and said, "Ms. Gabler, what gives you the right to tell us how we should do our job?" And my mother, to her credit, came up with 3 reasons, and one of them was that they pay taxes, so they pay for the books. They provide the children, and the third reason was the law gives them the mechanism to be there.
One of the publishers told me about 2 years ago, "We laughed at you every time you stood up. We took you as one big joke." I smiled and I said, "You don't laugh anymore." And he said, "No way, we'd rather face anybody in the nation than you."
In 1965, the Gablers moved their family and textbook reviewing operation to a bigger house about 30 miles east in the larger town of Longview.
When we moved there, it was a normal house. Over time, it became harder and harder to find a place to even sit down and so forth.
This was because the textbook reviewing operation literally took over the whole house. Bill Martin visited the Gablers back in the 1980s when he was writing a feature story for Texas Monthly.
Their home was filled with just walking through the hallways. It was just like walking through the corridors, narrow corridors of a warehouse where they had the books stacked up in their research and 1 or 2 people in there working away.
As the Gablers' reputation grew, textbook authors understood that they were a force to be reckoned with. And sometimes that reckoning might happen face to face.
Yeah, I was a young college professor.
That's Richard Bain, geography professor at Texas State University. I met him for breakfast at his favorite place, Cafe on the Square in the town of San Marcos, where he told me about his early experience of writing geography textbooks.
I had been invited by my publishing company to attend the textbook hearings in Austin with the school board. So, of course, I marched in proud as a peacock because here I was, the author of this textbook. And shortly after I arrived, I found out that of the 9 textbooks that were up for adoption that year, that mine was the one that had been subjected to scrutiny by the Gablers from East Texas.
Bain recalls that 2 of the Gablers' assistants walked forward with something like a large roller of paper towels. One assistant held the roller, and one grabbed the other end and unfurled a scroll of pages taped end to end, about 60 or 70 feet.
And said, "These are the errors that we've found in this geography book." And I'll tell you, if I could squirm down low and get beneath the seats and crawl out of the room, that's what I was thinking about at that particular moment.
Bain learned the hard way what many of Gabler's critics were forced to admit. They were darn good at ferreting out factual errors. ABC News cited some of the mistakes found by the Gablers in books for a social studies adoption.
One book says Napoleon's victories included Waterloo. Actually, Napoleon suffered his most famous defeat at Waterloo. On the Korean War, it says the United States settled the conflict by using the bomb. But an atomic bomb was never used in Korea.
I worked for Mr. Gabler 22 years before he died, and he never tried to hurry me through a project.
That's Neil Fry, a thin, bookish man with thick, horn-rimmed glasses, who used to be a college history professor. He caught many errors for the Gablers over the years. Fry says Mr. Gabler insisted on a meticulous review process because
the only way you can prove that you're not stupid to a secular liberal is to master detail better than they do. And if you master detail better than a secular liberal does, they will respect you. Otherwise, they'll despise you if you don't. But after you show them a few times that you've mastered the details of textbook content and of the textbook adoption process, as well as or better than they have, they will back off and respect you.
Finding factual errors gave the Gablers clout to address other issues, such as choice of content. In one reading anthology, Mel was troubled by some of the story selections.
They were overwhelmingly negative. Maybe 5 or 6 stories on death, or suicide, or cruelty, or morbidness, and so forth.
One of the stories was Shirley Jackson's short story classic, The Lottery, which is about a community stoning ritual passed down from generation to generation. After the Gablers' protests, the State Board of Education told several publishing companies that their anthologies could not be sold in Texas if they included the lottery. But in a way, it didn't really matter what the subject was, because to the Gablers, everything taught in the public schools was tainted by a pernicious religion called humanism.
The religion in which men have faith in mankind instead of faith in God. And humanism is prevalent in our textbooks from cover to cover in all grades and all subjects.
Since Texas purchased such large quantities of books, the Gablers' book reviews had national implications.
Her name is Norma Gabler, and she is formidable.
Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes interviewed the Gablers back in 1980.
She has been called education's public enemy #1. Who is she? Well, she is simply a housewife, the mother of 3 sons, and a grandmother, too. And though she's never gone to college, when Norma Gabler speaks, the education establishment of the state of Texas listens.
Every child should not have to sit in the classroom and read profanity and gutter language. You have an opportunity to read the textbooks. Go to Austin and tell them what you don't want in the books. It's your money, it's your children, and you have that right.
Wallace asked publishers and academics just how influential the Gablers were.
Tom Murphy is vice president of the textbook division of CBS-owned Holt Reinhardt. Has Murphy's publishing house ever changed material to suit the Gablers?
Yes, we did.
They probably had more influence on the use of textbooks in this country than any other 2 people.
In a 10-year period, the last 10 years, they've become more and more of a force for publishers to contend with.
If we want to sell the book, we are either faced with the dilemma of changing the material or not changing the material and taking the risk of not selling the material.
In the 1980s, after the Gablers and other groups protested the teaching of evolution, the Texas Board of Education forced publishers to stamp disclaimers in biology textbooks that read, "Any material on evolution included in this book is clearly presented as theory rather than verified fact." This stamp appeared in textbooks that were used in classrooms across the nation. Mel Gabler died in 2004 and Norma in 2007. Neil Fry continues the Gablers' textbook reviewing work. He and his staff of 3 work out of donated office space in the rear of an old retail store. A trickle of donations keeps the whole operation going.
God is leading us. In hindsight, they said, how did Gablers figure that out? Oh, we didn't figure it out. God just made it fall into place.
The Gablers created a method used by conservatives around the country for challenging textbooks. But this strategy has evolved into other ways of bringing conservative, patriotic Christian values into public schools. And that is by electing conservatives to school boards around the country and having them shape the standards that every child has to know.
We painted the textbook authors into the corner, and the evolutionists into the corner. Now they have to come up and show us what is their arguments, why it is so.
It's been about 9 years since I produced that documentary. And now a new focus has replaced evolution as a primary challenge over classroom curriculum and materials. Our nation's racial legacy and how it's taught.
Everything that the kids are doing is going through a lens of critical theory, whatever it is. It's this breakdown and highly critical way of looking at every single aspect of their lives, whether it's race, whether it's gender. It's a way of teaching that is pushing children to believe in this identity groupthink.
Coming up after a break, we'll hear more from Tiffany Justice, co-founder of Moms for Liberty. You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, and the CRC Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
It's Trey, and you're listening to Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Adam Lotz is an education and history professor at the University of Binghamton in New York. He's researched how the fight over classroom material has changed in the last 50 years. Before the break, he explained how Texas became a bellwether state for activists looking to challenge topics and books for classroom use. Lotz says the practice of removing content from textbooks became common enough in several southern states, it was given an unofficial term in the publishing world: mint julep editions.
So the mint julep editions were for the former Confederacy. Similar textbooks, publishers like ABC, American Book Company, made it's an unofficial word, they made Southern editions. The mint julep edition would have some content expurgated. They wouldn't change because that was expensive, but they could take some stuff out relatively cheaply. And so a lot of the big textbook publishers had mint julep editions. So there were regional variations. But in the 20th century, the way the market worked, if you could convince textbook publishers that the Texas School Board Adoption Committee would listen to citizens like Norma Gabler, well-informed citizens who they knew would take the time to go line by line through every proposed textbook and make the Gablers' protests were informed, they were exhaustive, and they were hard to counter. They would point out errors both of fact and what they saw as sort of ideological tendencies they didn't like. So they were able, by doing their homework, the Gablers were able to exert a huge influence nationwide.
You mentioned this detail that the Gablers put into their research and how it was that they made their protests known.
Mm-hmm.
Are there similarities to what the Gablers did as opposed to maybe how some of these book protests are playing out now?
Well, what I'm seeing, book lists like Representative Krause's are the opposite of the Gablers. It's everything that they hear may be having questionable content getting thrown into a list of sort of like red zone books. They're not being read carefully and carefully explained what the issue is in each specific book. That was the Gablers' MO, and it was very effective. What this list is books that are rumored to have certain content or certain ideas. The rumor is enough to, intimidate cautious politicians into agreeing to be against it. We haven't mentioned the best example of this might have been not from Texas, but from Tennessee, where another prize-winning book is banned because of rumors about its content.
Well, you're talking about Mouse, right? Right?
Yeah. If it's got a bad word and a naked drawing in it, you go to the school board and say this content has a naked woman and bad language. That's enough in this atmosphere of, we know there's a lot of books out there we don't want. If someone tells us that this has nudity and bad language, that's enough. Instead of saying, well, why was this book on the accepted list to begin with? Is there a value in this book regardless of the nudity and the bad language?
But the right to question things seems to be important. It's an important part to democracy. And the Gablers and parents today are exercising their right to push back on textbooks and classroom materials. What do you think is the soundest approach to raise questions about school materials?
I think the worst of the damage being done is in the current round of book politics and banning politics is the difficulty it has imposed on any discussion about what is appropriate and what we do want to have in schools, whether that's the state of Texas, the state of Tennessee, whether it's a local school district in Loudoun County, Virginia, wherever it is. We not just want to allow for discussion and debate, we need it.
Lott says the challenges to classroom materials usually come well after the books and curriculum are reviewed and approved.
We're seeing the same thing now play out, where instead of debating, discussing, having the input when it's called for and public solicitations of input for book lists, instead of having it before lists are made, lists are coming out and being protested against after the fact. When it puts the school board, it puts the state textbook committee, it puts them all in a terrible position because, well, the lists are made. So the only thing we can do is ban it. We can't talk about why it's there. We can't have any productive discussion about how important it is for students to read about things like sexuality or the Holocaust. All we can do is have one side accuse the other of cramming inappropriate material down children's throats, and then that side responds with its own insults, saying that people are, like Nazis, they're book banners. It's a very unproductive place to have a very unproductive discussion, instead of where it needs to take place, which is when the curriculum is decided upon in the beginning.
We're fighting for the survival of America. I truly believe that, and the survival of the family.
That's Tiffany Justice, co-founder of Moms for Liberty. After serving a term on the Indian River County School Board in Florida, she and Tina Deskovich founded the group.
It's a 4-year term.
Okay.
Yeah, so 2016 to 2020. So I got to also live COVID at the end of it and got to see what it looks like for an entire country and an education system to come to a screeching halt.
What about your experience on the school board led you to form Moms for Liberty?
So, I'll be honest, my parents were always a big part of my education, and I always felt that, I had teachers and things, but they also were really steering my education, and they were a big part of it. And so I've always kind of taken that approach with my own children. When I got on the school board, what I saw was an education system that was functioning very much for the adults and not for our children. And public education isn't supposed to be a jobs program, but I saw the union having this incredible influence in our children's education from things that you would never expect the union to have a hand in as a parent. All of a sudden it made sense to me why schedules were a certain way, or why there were certain early release days, and I saw all of the things that were negotiated as part of a teacher's contract that affected the quality of our children's education, and realized, wow, nobody's really speaking for the parents here. Parents don't have a seat at the table. The district had a seat. The school board members were basically union plants, and the union basically bargained with themselves.
So you were on the school board. You kind of saw all of this, like a dynamic that you felt where there were parents, they weren't being represented. And you decided to do something that was not necessarily being on the school board, but something else that might have a bigger impact?
Yeah. So, what I would tell you, honestly, is that, parents would come up and speak. So at the tail end of my school board time was during COVID. And I had very few regrets about my time on school board. I really enjoyed the experience. But one of the things that I recognized and really saw during the last probably year of my time was the fact that as a school board member, when people come up to the podium and they speak, if they're upset, they're normally upset about something if a parent comes. And then you have this moment of crisis where you're sitting on the school board, the superintendent's there with you, you have a parent there talking, right? Something's happened that's bad. They're upset about something that's happened to their child. It's a sensitive situation, and they've been driven to the point of now being public, which means they've probably gone through a few steps before that, right? Before they've had to publicly air what has happened to their child. And nothing was ever getting solved that way, to be honest with you. What would end up happening is the school board would direct the superintendent to go and handle that, right? To figure out what was happening in that issue. But it was like all these little fires that would pop up, and then the school district would put the fires out. During COVID, I saw parents coming up to the podium and expressing concerns about their children for any number of reasons. The forced masking was affecting their child for a number of different reasons. They had concerns about the forced masking. The quarantines were incredible. I can't even tell you the horrible effects of quarantining healthy children, and parents responding to that, school closures, teacher app. I mean, it was just one thing after another. And so the district really didn't care.
Justice says school administrators have not taken parental outrage seriously because parents aren't properly organized.
And I decided that I needed to build an army. Tina Deskovich, the co-founder of Moms for Liberty, was a school board member as well. She ran for re-election. I did not, because I knew that I needed to build an army to help to support me. On my board with masking, I was alone in fighting forced masking and fighting for parental rights. But if I had been able to get one more person on my side, I would have been able to get the third vote. And the public pressure wasn't there to do it, unfortunately. But I could have gotten it done if I had had the right, if I had had the parents' voices amplified enough.
Tiffany, you've said a couple times that you felt like you needed to start an army. So I'm curious.
Yeah, we're building an army.
Building an army. So what I guess I'm curious, like, why do you choose that language? It's military language. Why an army?
We are joyful warriors because we're fighting for the survival of America. I truly believe that, and the survival of the family. I mean, our moms know that this is bigger than just the classroom. Your parental rights do not stop at the classroom door, but our parents know that they are part of a bigger process here, which is reclaiming education in America. What's happening in our schoolhouses, as Abraham Lincoln so poignantly said in a better way than me. But he basically said what happens in the schoolhouse is the government that you get in the future. And what we're seeing is a concerted effort to destroy the nuclear family and to create an identity crisis in the heart and mind of every American child. We feel this is bad for children. Children are being robbed of their innocence, and it's not right. And so parents are coming together now, and we do believe we are fighting for the survival of America because the children are the future.
So you said before that what is happening in I guess this deterioration of the schools as you see it, that it is creating an identity crisis and that it's destroying the nuclear family. And can you give me some examples of how that may be, how that's playing out?
I think we see that America's children are in the middle of a very serious and alarming mental health crisis. And we're very concerned about that. And when we look at the way that the school is behaving in the life of the child, it's a very dark and toxic setting for them oftentimes, with material in it, this idea of we're just going to teach everything and nothing's off topic, and that there's some social crusade by schools to go further than teaching the child how to read, but to actually create them as social activists. And one of the things that I went on Dr. Phil and I debated on CRT, and one of the things I said was, before you turn our children into social justice warriors, can you just teach them to read? Because Moms for Liberty parents are very concerned that a majority of children in America's public school classrooms are not reading proficiently.
That reference to CRT, it's short for something called critical race theory. And it's become one of the most frequent challenges over current public school teaching. CRT is a legal concept that suggests racial bias is inherent in U.S. laws and institutions. It is not part of public school curriculum. However, it's now a term used to refer to any teaching of racial history, privilege, or bias. Critics say it sees Americans as irredeemably racist. Tiffany Justice says it targets children with shame and guilt. Well, let's focus on that a little bit. What is your primary concern with regard to how American history is taught today in the classroom?
That I think children are being taught that we're not part of making America a more perfect union, but that it's an irretrievably broken place that has no ability to be fixed. Children are being taught you're oppressed or you're an oppressor, and that there's no escape from that. You have Ibram Kendi saying that the only way to cure prior discrimination or current discrimination is by creating future discrimination. Those are words out of his mouth, not mine. And so our children are being fed a steady diet of America the problematic in America's public schools. This is American public school. You understand, right? This is a public school. The public school teachers don't have the right to free speech. The public education system, they don't have the right to free speech. You understand that, right? There's a curriculum. There are standards. There are standards to be covered. Those standards are put together by boards of education in states, right, that are approved. There's a system here to what's supposed to be being taught in America's public school classrooms. We can have a conversation about what should be taught and what shouldn't be taught, and I think that's appropriate. Let's have that conversation, but we didn't get to have that conversation, Trey. What's being taught in America's public schools has changed, and it's going around the standards and what we have promised to teach in America's public schools, to unfold the full potential of every child, giving them the tools that they need to be successful in life, reading, writing, math, right? These things that we understood as Americans we were getting from our public education system is not happening.
Tiffany Justice says Moms for Liberty is not just focused on how the country's racial history is taught. They're also concerned about the classroom material on sex and gender issues.
The moms don't want graphic, sexually explicit content in the books in school. They think it's inappropriate because there are actually laws that prevent obscenity and pornography from being shown to students. That's gross. No, but I want to say, so we're talking about when people say like, oh, both sides. Let's be honest about that, because I don't think that the side where Moms for Liberty moms are standing has been clearly or fairly portrayed. I think there's been an effort to marginalize these parents and vilify them. You know, I'm a mom of 4. I like sex. I have no problem with it. I don't want to talk about sex or show sex to my 10-year-old. But again, I'm a grown woman, right? I'm not some Puritan saint. So this idea, but I think that, we keep getting polarized into these positions. So you say, isn't there a division? I think there is a division that they would like to make seem so, but I think we have much more in common as parents than we have different.
But Adam Lotz, the former high school educator and university researcher I spoke with earlier, says Justice's concerns about what's being taught in America's classrooms are far from mainstream.
It doesn't take a lot of, Tiffany Justices to turn a conversation between teachers and parents into an accusation and a defense and a very angry kind of meeting. And there are parents and activists like that who really do, who maybe they've had bad experiences, or maybe they've read a lot of scare stories about what can happen in schools. But I do stand by it that the loud do not define the crowd. The fact that there are one or even some people who stand out and get attention, if they were saying something that everyone agreed with, it wouldn't be very attention grabbing. But when they say something that seems provocative, it's because it is something that other people aren't saying. So to stand and accuse America's teachers of intentional ideological harm to children, that is not a mainstream idea. You cannot convince me, and it's not just me. Gallup polls back this up, and they have backed it up since the 1980s. The majorities are always in the 3/4-ish, 74 to 77% of parents who give their kids' schools an A or a B. And you do not give your kids' schools an A or a B when you think that they are hiring teachers who are trying to harm your children. That doesn't fit. Now, 77% leaves a lot of room for angrier parents, for sure. But if we're talking about majorities, if we're talking about tendencies, I do believe that there are plenty of anxious, nervous, fearful parents who think that teachers are not working in their kids' best interest, but I think that they're a minority.
Both Adam Lotz and Tiffany Justice see themselves as part of a silent majority when it comes to education in America. Lotz says most parents have faith in public schools. Justice says teachers' unions and school boards are pushing an agenda that's disrupting the fabric of mainstream society. Or, as Norma Gabler, the textbook challenger from Texas, put it,
why should a handful of liberals totally control what's going on in our textbooks?
Educator Adam Lotz says rather than setting any social agenda, schools play catch-up, trying to update curriculum to match the varying views of American culture. Lott says when people challenge a textbook or classroom materials, it can serve a more cynical purpose.
Arkansas passed a law in 1928 to ban the teaching of evolution, and then it wasn't long before they adopted a textbook that taught evolution. So in order to teach the curriculum in Arkansas, you had to break the law of Arkansas. No one cared. The state legislature didn't care anymore. Once it passed its law, got its votes, made their speeches, the fact that their law was actually irrelevant, the law was impossible to carry out. None of the anti-evolution activists cared, of the politicians cared at that point. They had got what they could out of the anti-evolution sentiment. It took a while, but eventually a teacher had to sue to say, hey, look, I can't obey the law and teach the curriculum. The push among state legislatures, and we can use Matt Krause as an example, the push among state legislatures for bans, whether it's bans of books or bans of ideas, that push only lasts as long as, the next election. What they need, and this is just their business, what they need is votes. What they don't do is monitor after the fact how that ban is implemented.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode is me, Trey Kay, and Kate Smith. If you'd like to hear my great textbook war documentary about the 1974 textbook controversy in Kanawha County, West Virginia, or my documentary about culture wars over curriculum battles in Texas, which feature Mel and Norma Gabler, we've posted links on our show page at wvpublic.org. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, and the CRC Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the Mentorship Program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the Mentorship Program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.